Hi, I'm Dhruti Shah and welcome to Season 4 of my podcast, Have You Thought About? I'm a writer who loves to find out about what passions people are pursuing, especially if they're managing to blend together their skills in unusual ways. In each edition, I chat with someone who's managed to fit things together in their life or profession that you might not think of as an obvious match. Here we're going to hear from do-it-yourself foreign correspondent Anu Anand Hall, who's also now trying to be a good local citizen. So let's start by talking about the different types of journalism you've been doing over that very illustrious career that you have, and how that's also fed into a lot of the other storytelling that you do.
Oh, well, thank you for saying all those nice things. So I started in high school. I started on the school newspaper, but I very quickly moved abroad because at that time in the US, I grew up in the southern US. There was nobody that looked like me really in journalism. That's changed now. But back in the late 90s, I didn't see myself working in broadcast journalism. I didn't think anybody would be able to take me saying my name on air. I just thought that would be a huge barrier. I ended up in New Delhi in India. And the reason was because I spoke the language and I had a kind of safety net. I ended up working for 1 rupee a word. That's like 1 pence or 1 US cent per word. So I would go into United Press International, a US press agency in Delhi, and I would write my heart out to earn as much money as I could, so that I could afford the basics. And this is before India liberalized. So you could live on $300 or $400 a month in those days. And I did, but it was still tough. I didn't have an air conditioner. I didn't take taxis anywhere. I could only afford auto rickshaws. I didn't have a telephone in those days because it wasn't easy to get a telephone line. And I had to kind of beg, borrow, and steal gas cylinders because you had to have an account. And, it was very bureaucratic. It wasn't like it is today. So that's how I started. And I ended up covering some of the big stories of the time. I covered the death of Mother Teresa. I covered the first nuclear tests that India did. Vajpayee and the BJP, Atal Bihari Vajpayee, the leader of the right-wing Hindu Nationalist Party, the BJP, appeared then on the national stage. So I covered a lot of that. And I covered 50 years of Indian independence, which was like this golden opportunity for me, this kid who had grown up, the grandchild of refugees and sort of really disembodied from my history living in the southern US, for me to totally rediscover what it was I had come from, what the history was that I had come from. And that was the most extraordinary moment, I think, for me as a journalist, because it just brought my whole world full circle. And I got to go and stand on the India-Pakistan border, and I got to go interview Maharajas from the time, where the whole system of their livelihood, their existence had changed with the coming of the Indian Republic. I got to meet freedom fighters. And I mean, that was just the most extraordinary thing. And then I met my husband in India, and he's English, Anglo-American, grew up in London, and never planned it, but ended up coming to the UK. And so that sort of led me into the kind of media industry in London. I worked for ITN. I worked for CNN and traveled a lot, but then ended up at the BBC World Service. And I loved it the minute I was there. It was like, I call it the Noah's Ark of humanity. There's like 2 of every person in the world, like wandering around. I would go down into the cafeteria and I just couldn't believe where I was. And I absolutely loved it. And I never left. And I ended up, covering lots of stuff. Early in my career, I was just learning to be on air when 9/11 happened, to right towards the end of my full-time kind of career at the BBC, Brexit, the Nepal earthquake. I think Trump was on the scene by then. So those stories and everything in between. And I did also live in India on and off for about 10 years. So I've really watched India transform from this sleepy, closed economy to like this insane, hyper-driven global force where sometimes it feels like you have the worst of capitalism and the worst of socialism, like just totally messing with your day. But it's just, it's extraordinary. I could live in India for 3 lifetimes and I still wouldn't fully understand or know everything I need to know. But that's what I've done for my career.
Wow. So you've been a real witness to history, as it were, and even like the present that's happening. But with you, how have you managed to retain a sense of identity while also being fully immersed in this world of journalism and these pretty hardcore stories they're huge, that you could be awake from morning to night working on these sort of stories? You're imbibing a lot in. So how do we retain that sense of Anu?
That question cuts right to the heart of me, I think, because I'm really struggling with that later in life. I'm struggling with it a lot now. I mean, I feel like a perpetual outsider. And I feel that, and I think, you're the same in a way, because you have that kind of triple identity. There's the Indian side. There's, I think in your case, the East African side. In my case, it's the American side. And then the British side. I really struggle with it. I really struggle with it. I bounce back and forth now, especially since the pandemic, because I think the pandemic made it harder to move around. And it suddenly made me realize what would happen to my identity if I were in one place and I could no longer move between those other spaces. And that was terrifying because I don't exist in my head in one space. That's been really hard. And I think Britain has changed a lot. This is where I live pretty much full time, and I have done for about 25 years. And the Britain that I first came to when I was in my 20s, I was a very different person and the country was very different. And now I'm in my early 50s and the country is very different. And when the fears you have on the inside manifest on the outside, that's really terrifying. I at the moment feel pretty disembodied in today's Britain. And some of that comes from, yes, I've done all this amazing stuff. Where has it led me? I don't know, because journalism is changing. The landscape is changing. Apparently, as a 50-year-old woman, I just don't have the currency anymore. So that's a bit of a shock. I've just been through perimenopause, which has been a huge shock. It's really hard. My family's far away. I have zero family. I have no childhood memories in this country. And I think it's really hard to understand how difficult that is. I often think about refugees. I think about my grandparents who were made refugees by partition, but I think about other refugees that I've dealt with or lived with or worked with. And I think I need to learn something from them, because I feel really at sea in my 50s suddenly, in a way maybe that a lot of people feel, but I've certainly never felt before. So I feel like my identity is in total flux. I mean, I have 3 nationalities. I was born in India. I grew up in the US until I was in my early 20s, went back to India, and then ended up in Britain. So I've really split my life on 3 continents. And when I'm in the UK, I feel very American. I feel very Indian. When I'm in America, I feel a little more British. And, when I'm in India, there are times when I feel more American. So I think it's a blessing and a curse. You always have the choice, but having the choice can make you feel very unsettled where you are in that moment. And I'm reading a really interesting book at the moment called The Paradox of Choice. And it argues that in today's kind of hyper-consumerist world, choice is a blessing in limited amounts. But in unlimited amounts, it becomes a paralyzing force, and it can make you feel that nothing is ever good enough because you're constantly trying to execute an element of choice. And I think that's part of the reason that while I'm struggling with the whole thing of identity and place, I've made this really kind of almost violent conscious effort to be in one place and to embrace what I have in that one place, and not to try and move around, not to travel around, not to globetrot, to kind of just be here day to day and just to grapple with what it is to be a good human being in one place. Because I think that's hard enough without then traveling to lots of other places.
But that anchoring right now, you used a sea metaphor earlier. With that anchoring, do you ever feel that you're missing out?
Yeah, I do. No, I do. Oh my gosh, do I ever. I'm guilty of lying in bed late at night, browsing jobs and houses in other places on the planet. And to be honest, I think it's a self-inflicted disease, the fear of missing out, because it's only by looking at other stuff constantly that you feel that what you have is not good enough. And so I think it's a question of stopping yourself. So I sort of told you the story of, up until moving to Britain, but the other chunk of my story is that I spent a good 20 years in global news. I have loved it and I have learned so much from it. But the last 2 years that I was at the BBC, I worked in business news. And it was really interesting. I'm not at all someone with a business news background. It was just a job that I got recruited for. But I think it was really interesting because being in the business world, it just made me confront a lot of home truths. And they were really uncomfortable ones. Like, why are men being paid more than women? Why do minority employees get paid less? why are we so hyper-focused on growth and profits? What is happening to our environment? But more critically, these are things I think everybody thinks about. More critically, what is my life contributing to this? Now, I don't have those answers, but I think what happened to me about 5 years ago, I quit my job and I just walked away from journalism because I was having to commute into London, and it was just, the rat race was so intense and so damaging. I was so burnt out, and my health was like really beginning to unravel. My mental health had absolutely kind of just hit the rocks. And I think those uncomfortable questions led me to I walked away from the whole thing because I needed time to stop and think. Now, I thought it was going to be a short break, and then the pandemic hit 5 months later. I think the sense of identity, the sense of place, the fear of missing out, this is a disease that we're all suffering from, and I'm still trying to find those answers, but I know that the answer is not in chasing more stuff. It's not in chasing more kudos, more attention, more rungs on the career ladder, more lines for the CV. For me, at least, that isn't the answer. And so I've been doing a mix of work, but what I've been trying to do is kind of figure out what I stand for, who I am. And that's hard when, as I say, both my sets of grandparents were made refugees in 1947 by the partition of India by the British. One set of grandparents became permanent refugees. They left the town that they had lived in for generations. And then my father was an economic migrant who went to the US, and I have ended up being this voluntary globe-trotting person. And to me, my journey comes back to like some really basic fundamentals. I think it's about unconditional love. I think my grandparents were deeply betrayed by the government and the society that they were a part of and had invested in, and I don't think they ever recovered from that. I think they transmitted that distrust and fear to my father. And I think my father, despite moving to the US, and I think he really appreciates being there, but I think he brought, sadly, a sense of not fitting in, not ever wanting to fit in, not trusting. And he transmitted that to me and to my siblings. And I'm the only one of the 4 siblings who's then lived in different places in the world. And so I think at 50, what my life is really about is, can I create some kind of unconditional love, whether that's in a job, whether that's in my family, whether that's towards myself, whether that's towards the planet, the world? Is there a way for me to take all of this wonderful insight from traveling the world and reporting on it and just make it better in one place where I am? And as I say, I don't have the answers. I don't feel I'm missing out. I feel like I've done so much that I'm super lucky. If I go back to my grandparents, I don't think any of them would have ever predicted that I've done what I've done. So I think, extremely lucky. I miss my family sometimes, and I miss the good weather in parts of the US. Less and less, I don't feel like I'm missing out. I'm not connected to social media 24/7 in the way that I was in my job. And I think that's been a huge, huge help.
In fact, I was going to pick up on that in terms of the local element and you rooting yourself, but also you've described yourself as a DIY foreign correspondent. So the lessons you've learned while you've had to pick yourself up and plant yourself in spaces, which can be lonely spaces, let's face it, when you're moving somewhere new. What lessons have you picked up from that you now take and have evolved with what you're doing with the community building where you are now?
In some ways, it's probably contradictory lessons if you look at it just on paper. I mean, on the one hand, I would say one big lesson is absolutely do what you want to do. Like when I was living in the US working in local television where everybody around me was, nobody looked like me. I was actually told by my first employer that my voice wasn't deep enough and maybe if I took up smoking, that would help. And I just sort of sat there totally incredulous. I've always gotten these messages from employers that I don't fit in. More recently, I had a boss very jovially tell me that I was too old. Too old for that radio program. Again, I just sort of did a double take. And then she said, well, I'm too old too. And I just thought, okay, whatever. I think one lesson is don't listen to those voices. Just don't listen to them. They don't know what they're talking about. So going to India, just buying an open return ticket for a year, packing a bag and going to India did pay off. It launched me in a career that I've loved. But I also think for me, I'm sadly not someone, I enjoy a lot of privileges, but having a huge family support, having really supportive elders, a network, even within my husband's family, is not something I enjoy. So paradoxically, I would also say that if you are someone who's, come from some kind of intergenerational refugee background, if you are a multinational person, if you are someone, who's having to live your life across many borders, be kind to yourself and have a community. Because when the work goes away, the mistake I made was to think that my work was my family. And that's sadly just wrong. I have wonderful friends who I will know for the rest of my life, but work is not a family. And when the winds change and you don't fit in, or you're let go, or it doesn't work anymore, you need unconditional love. You need family. You need community. And I fear that, too many people are kind of following the economic winds because they think that the only thing in life is success within work and money. But when that pillar, if it falls away or if it changes, you've got to have the other pillars there. My lessons would be absolutely be fearless and try what you want. I went for many correspondent jobs at the BBC. I was always encouraged, never got them. And one day we were living in London, just decided, you know what? Actually, the last time I checked, you could book a plane ticket and go and be somewhere, and you didn't need permission. And so I went to India and I set myself up for many years, and I earned my living fully from journalism for many years. You don't need permission. You don't need the gatekeepers to tell you that you are allowed to be part of their club. If they have a club and you're not in it, form your own club. The world is a big place. You have to be careful then not to measure your success by their metrics, because if they're not letting you into your club, you can't then imagine that you're only successful if you look like them. So you have to be careful to separate out those very sticky things in your head about having worth. But if you can do that, go for it. But also, if it's possible, don't forget to build that community. That's the thing that I'm really focused on now, because I've always been very sociable, but I think I've been a little naive about what community is and what it involves. It isn't just a kind of global social media tribal community. When you're older, it needs to be a physical community. So that's what I'm trying to do now, whether it's journalism related or whether it's, other adjacent work. I try to keep it as local as I possibly can.
What does that involve? You're keeping it as local as you can. What are you doing?
So I now live in Bath. It's about 90 miles west of London. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It's a lovely little city. And the story of how we ended up here is pretty random, as are a lot of things in my life. We were living in New Delhi with our 2 young children. We had just been given the data on the air pollution. So this was back in 2014. And it was so horrific and so life-changing that we started, like a lot of people who were living there at the time, to think, we've got to get out of here. What are our options? Now, we were lucky that we have multiple passports. Not everybody has those choices. And so we kind of came to the inevitable conclusion that we needed to leave India, which was heartbreaking. I think I cried for a month. I mean, I didn't want to leave. None of us did. But for the sake of our younger children, we felt that it was irresponsible to keep them in an environment where their developing lungs were effectively going to be ruined. If we had the choice, we had to leave. How did 2 totally independent journalists, my husband's an author, where do we go? We don't have a head office telling us where to go. We don't have a landing spot. We thought about going to the US. It just seemed too far a leap, even though my family's there. So we ended up back in the UK, but we didn't want to be in London. My husband had a family connection to Bath. And so we'd visited once or twice. And he just said to me randomly one day in Delhi, why don't we just check out Bath? If it doesn't work out, we'll leave after a year. So I came, I had a look around. I loved it. And as I sit here talking to you, I'm looking out over 2 300-year-old trees. One is a copper beech. One is a majestic maple. They are about the height of a 6 or 8-story building. I'm looking out onto a green square. Often on the weekends, when I look out my back windows, there are hot air balloons flying over. The view from my children's bedrooms looks like it's the rooftops out of Peter Pan. It's a friendly community. The biggest thing when I first moved here, I remember feeling like I had been literally like Star Trek, kind of, what do they do when they kind of just, transport themselves across galaxies? I felt like I had been transported from this mega city in, New Delhi, where you couldn't open the windows. The air was so toxic, to this place where for the first few months, I literally just walked around, just like taking these deep lungfuls and going, the air smells like flowers. I mean, this is incredible. And I've met quite a few air pollution refugees here and other places, people who have left places that they loved because of the air pollution, and, they can, so they're lucky. So Bath isn't exactly the epicenter of global news. It's where Bridgerton is filmed. And so it's, got a lot of tourists walking around hoping they're going to spot really hot, multiracial men in Georgian costumes. Doesn't happen, sadly, but it's not the epicenter of journalism at all. But it's teaching me about what life as a British person is outside of London. And I think that's incredibly valuable, because I can see as a foreigner why Brexit happened. London is the sun and it sucks in everything, and the rest of the UK kind of struggles to attract the same kind of opportunity. So what I'm doing is I'm still doing journalism. I still present programs occasionally for the BBC. I was just in Michigan in the US for BBC World Questions. So we were doing a live audience debate on the upcoming presidential election. I had a recent Radio 4 documentary on the number of insolvencies in the UK. I am also teaching. I teach broadcast journalism to students at one of the universities here, which has been fascinating. I do some nonfiction audiobook narration as well as producing. So at the moment, I'm literally being paid to listen to a voice actor in LA read Karl Marx's Capital. I've never read Capital, so I am fascinated to actually be reading it. And it's blowing my mind in so many ways, thinking about the way our economic hierarchies are set up and maintained, about, the wage inequalities. And, Karl Marx had a very certain point of view, but it's still fascinating to go back to his world in the 1880s and think about what he was saying in the context of today. And I'm job hunting, honestly, Jutiya, wondering how do I help local communities feel connected. I do that through volunteering with a lot of different things here. I'm feeling lonely a lot of the time and really puzzled by that. I'm thinking, is it because I'm old? Is it because I'm a parent? Is it post-COVID? What is going on? But again, I don't think I'm alone. I think these are just really monumental changes that we're all experiencing in different ways. Working from home, bloody lonely. It's got its upsides, but there's a downside of being isolated. I'm trying out a lot of different things. I often say that this is my second adolescence. I'm going, hey, maybe I'll cook for a living. Hey, maybe I'll be a tour guide. I'm playing with a lot of ideas in my head, and I'm thinking about how I bring the experience I've had to it, and can I turn that into something where I can pay the bills? So that's what I'm doing.
All very familiar. Like, I completely am getting that loneliness, the trying to figure stuff out, the fact you have such a wide breadth of experience, but then what is transferable? What do you use in this very strange economic climate right now? But one other thing that I think is really important for our audience to be aware of, and that really makes you stand out, your love of language. Like, for you, it's incredibly important. You've authored a multilingual book. It's a children's book, which is not the easiest audience to write for. So what are you doing around language, linguistic abilities, and maintaining your own sort of heritage, I guess?
So that started because while we were living in India, I had these two little kids, and we're a mixed race marriage. My husband is not from an Indian family, but my father raised me absolutely to speak Hindi from when I started talking. And I didn't appreciate it at first. And then it's become such a huge gift, allows me to understand people in India, northern India, what they're saying. It's one of only 16 official languages, but it's given me such an incredible gift of being able to understand people. I've even been to places, like the Kurdish areas of Syria, where the Kurdish language has a lot of Persian in it. So if you speak Hindi or Urdu, every fourth word or so, I could understand what they were saying. I just feel like it unlocks doors. Being able to understand the language that you're reporting in, I think is absolutely vital. I've never really understood once I'd gone to India why you would have a foreign correspondent. That makes no sense. You want someone from the country who really understands the language. Now, I understand you then have to train that person to have a much bigger worldview because it's very hard to report on things that are just your normal, right? I mean, fish don't notice the water they're in. So there's a real balance between being an insider and being an outsider, but to not be able to understand the language that's surrounding you, I find that insane that you would send someone to report, because you can be sitting trying to interview random people. If you understand the language, you know whether they are slightly mad, whether they are, as in like they're just babbling at you about something completely incoherent. You know if they're angry, you know if they're nervous. You know, if they're smart, you pick up so many clues by hearing people speak in their own language. You pick up on issues that they won't even really be able to articulate that you can then incorporate into your reporting. So language is hugely important. While we were living in India, my children, amazingly, were not picking up Hindi. And I was baffled by this. And then I realized it was because they were hearing it, but they weren't having to speak it. Their immediate environment was bilingual. They were just choosing the common language. They were choosing the common family language. So despite the fact that I was in India, my children were not learning Hindi. And when I tried to strengthen that, I realized that all of the material that was available to me as the parent of a toddler was in English. Or if it was in Hindi, it was either too far above their age range, or it was really outdated. So there was nothing simple, appropriate, positive, age appropriate. And at that time, this was around about 2012, I decided that I would create a book for them that I could just read to them at night, because I was too tired at night to start, suddenly, spontaneously translating Julia Donaldson into Hindi. Like I couldn't do that at bedtime. And so I created this book called Meri Bindi, which I then thought, I'll make it into an ebook. I'll just get it online. So then I stumbled into like a 1-year odyssey of like trying to work out how you created an ebook and how you rendered Hindi fonts so that they turned up on every device in the right form. And it was really technical. I got an illustrator who created the most beautiful illustrations. And when she sent them to me, I thought, this has to be a real book. And eventually, through a total quirk of circumstances, Hachette in India, their children's division, said they wanted to publish and distribute it. In 2016, on my last day in India after we had decided to leave, on the day I was flying, I got the first consignment, the box of printed books. It's so typical. You work really hard for several years on something and then you have to move on. And the book, had a kind of modest life in India, was distributed within India. And when the rights ran out with Hachette, I got the rights to the book back. And so I've been trying to promote it. I have discovered an absolute universe of South Asian creators, parents mostly, who are passionate about language, who are creating all kinds of amazing products, books, games, electronic kind of software. There's a brilliant thing called Shunya Kids. Shunya means the word for zero in Hindi. The founder is a woman called Rashi Bari, who's in California, who's very similar to me. And she's in the tech world. And so she's created this beautiful app that does multiple languages. My partner in the US, Anita, is the founder of a thing called Bhasha Kids. Bhasha means language. So Bhasha Kids distributes a lot of materials in Indian languages. So she creates her own materials in Tamil, in Malayalam, in Hindi, a couple of other languages. I distribute her goods here in the UK and the EU, and she distributes my book in the US. We both do it on the side. It's really hard work. It's really hard to get attention. It's hard to get sales. It's hard to collaborate. But there are a lot of people doing it.
And that was the amazing Anu Anand Hall, do-it-yourself correspondent, broadcaster, author, podcaster, and a whole lot more. Do you have an interdisciplinary life? Because I would love to hear from you, and maybe we can chat on this podcast that goes with my newsletter, which is also called Have You Thought About, and can be found via www.drutisha.com. Please join me next time for a great conversation with another guest who likes to mix up lots of things in their life. Do listen to past episodes and rate and review the podcast if you've enjoyed it. Thank you to Reen Shah for the music.